Hello, for the Los Angeles Times, I'm Mark Olsen, and welcome to another of our virtual Indie Focus screening series events. For information on other LA Times events, as well as to subscribe to my weekly movies newsletter, please go to latimes.com/subscribe. The film Wander Darkly premiered earlier this year at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival and explores the aftermath of a traumatic accident and how it impacts the lives of a couple with an infant daughter, a new house, and so much ahead of them. The film is an emotional portrait of romance and real life, and also an enigmatically fragmented drama that questions so much of what we take for granted in conventional storytelling. I'm very excited to be joined for a conversation today with writer-director Tara Miele and lead actress Sienna Miller. Thank you both for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having
me. Tara, I'm going to begin with a question for you, in that the story of the movie is rooted in you and your husband were actually in a very severe car accident, and I'm just wondering, what was the leap to turn that into drama? Like, at what point did you realize like there was a story to be told there?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. One was sort of right after the accident happened, I blacked out and I was sort of screaming like, I can't see. And at some point I was pissed that my husband wasn't responding to me, which is ridiculous. But at some point he said, I can't breathe. And I remember that sort of dissonance of like, it didn't even occur to me that something could have happened to him. And then sort of coming out of that experience, just feeling this immense gratitude for the fact that we were okay and desperately wanting to share that feeling. I guess the way that I do that is to make a movie. I just take like 7 years of my life and just now I've written the letter that I had to write. So, but yeah, it was stuck in me, that it was just a feeling. And there were some things that I had wanted to explore for a few years that then started like kind of snowballing on top of, okay, I have this feeling. I want to tell a story about this couple. I wanted to sort of share the experience of a concussion. I had lost a lot of people in my life in the 3 years prior to that accident or around that accident. And I was very interested in sort of the psychosis of grief, the experience of a concussion, and the grief of when you lose a relationship. And so all of those things sort of started moving forward together.
I know, Sienna, as I understand it, Tara and the producers of the film did not initially come to you. You really went after the role in the film. What was it about the script that made you want to pursue it like that?
You know, I read it and it's a really hard thing to articulate. Essentially, there's like just some intuition light goes off, and I read the script and I sobbed at the end. I thought it was beautiful. It was unlike anything I'd ever read before. And then I did the very un-English thing of phoning the producer and saying, I'd really like to play this part. And it's like I said, it's just these things resonate. Something landed and I had a total vision for it. I saw it all completely in my head and I knew it was something I really wanted to do. So I was lucky.
And Tara, I don't know where you were in the casting process then, but what do you do when Sienna Miller phones and like says she really wants to do your movie?
You freak out a lot and you go, really? Okay, great. Yes, great. And then truthfully, you know, it's funny. I always say that Sienna's such a chameleon, so you almost forget how many amazing different personifications of her you've seen. And so I went back and did all my homework again and watched all of these wonderful performances of her that I had seen, and I was really excited about how transformative Sienna is as a performer, but that I didn't think she had done this yet. I didn't, you know, I felt like that this was something really new, and she was so game to jump into it. We had this wonderful FaceTime, you know, over the summer before we shot, and she just was like down. She was down to do the indie guerrilla, crazy, whatever it took version of this, and I couldn't have been more excited that she was interested in this project. It was really, we were really lucky.
Because maybe especially when you were pitching the story, Tara, how do you describe the movie to people? Because there's a way in which it's a drama, it's a romance, it's also a little bit of like a horror or ghost story. Like how would you describe the story to people?
I mean, like the log line, you mean? Is that what
just how do you describe this somewhat complicated, like how do you convey how sort of like complicated the storytelling is when you're trying to, like, you know, explain the story to someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were talking about that in the aftermath of a traumatic accident, a couple has to navigate. Oh God, now I can't remember. It's been too long, Mark. It's been too long since I was like pitching the log line. Here's the truth. I think that we were talking about it as this meets this a lot to try to explain the different layers of it. So, um, Eternal Sunshine meets Ghost, or something like that we were talking about. But at my heart, I think that it is a romance first, and some version of a ghost story or thriller or psychological exploration second. I feel like I'm not answering your question.
No, I think you are. But were there any specific sort of references or influences that you had when you were just writing the film?
Not so much when I was writing, more after because I feel like sometimes when I'm writing, stuff kind of gets in my head too much. So I tend not to watch before I write. But certainly when I started directing, and you're right, like when I started talking to people, the Fisher King, the way that Terry Gilliam dealt with psychosis and the psychosis of grief in that film in such a fantastical and horror way that also incorporated true heartfelt drama and comedy. Also, we talked about The Sixth Sense a bit, Blue Valentine for sure, Eternal Sunshine. Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of films that certainly bubbled up around it. Jacob's Ladder. I remember sitting down and watching Jacob's Ladder and thinking, oh, there's some similarities here. Like I have to watch how this all worked through. And I like there's like that sort of interesting gray piece before when I'm switching from my writer hat into my director hat that I really like to absorb a lot and then let it all go. And then, but the truth is, I think for me, I really wanted to try to craft something that worked in the way that my head does, which is not often very much in the present. And certainly being concussed after the accident exacerbated that. But I was really interested in that. Somebody who's reflecting on the past all the time and projecting into the future, and sort of that constant work to come into the present and be in the now and appreciate what's in that moment.
Because Sienna, I've heard you describe this as the most challenging role of your career. How so?
It's really hard to talk about. I tend to be drawn to super emotional, intense things. There was something about the fugue state or the disorientation, the grief, really, the heavy grief. It just felt, it was arduous and it was taxing and it was difficult because we had an indie budget and we had 24 days, and it was complicated to mine that deeply with that time schedule. Also, the whole notion of pivoting in a scene where you're kind of replaying the past and then commenting on it from the present, it felt almost like a breaking of a fourth wall. It was really not a natural experience. So that kind of stuff was really challenging. And I just think sitting in the space of what would that be like if you actually believe that you were in some sort of disillusionment and then you find out that the person that you love, it was really hard. It was really hard, but it tends to be that way that the best things are somehow.
Because Tara, can you describe a little bit those pivots that take place in the story? I think especially, I'm so curious how that would just read on the page, because sometimes within the space of a single scene, it sort of exists both in the sort of the past and the present of the storytelling. And I'm wondering how you sort of convey that to an actor, that those switches are going to be taking place.
Yeah, I think in my first draft, I just did it, and I didn't think that there would be any sort of like confusion about why it would work. It made perfect sense in my head. And then I went back in, and I think this was like a note from Lynette and Sam at 51, and we just made like an asterisk. The first time that an actor did it, which I think is when Mateo is in the hospital, and he says to her, "See, we have a baby." So there was like a little asterisk, and it said like, there will be times when the actors break from the scene and narrate as if in the present. I think something to that effect. And it worked. I mean, we never had anybody read the script and say didn't understand it or what was happening. It never seemed to bump anybody on the script. The place where it really bumped was when we had to put it on its feet. because then suddenly the Sienna and Diego are having to really do U-turns. Like you feel one way, you're in a scene, you're marching towards it, and then all of a sudden you go, oh wait, oh God, I sucked in that moment. And that was a really hard thing to navigate, just to give them time and space to explore it, just because we were shooting so quickly. But we spent a lot of time together. We did a week of rehearsals beforehand, and we're really strategic about where those turns were so that Sienna and Diego were turning at the exact same time together. And we always tried to enhance that with camera in different ways throughout to sort of signal the turn. Sometimes it's just a pause, an editorial pause. Sometimes the camera's doing a little wrap so that you feel like you're shifting into something new. And we never wanted it to sort of repeat itself. It always wanted to be like, per the scene, per the moment, what would feel right to get us into that space, and never anything too drastic, you know.
And Sienna, were those moments a challenge? Like, how did you sort of figure out how to navigate those shifts when, like, you're in a scene and then suddenly you're out of a scene and then you're back in the scene in such a short span of time?
You know, it was really, we felt really self-conscious, and thank God we had this brilliant director at the helm of it. But it's nothing that you can kind of finish a scene and be like, oh, we crushed that. You're like, what is happening? Because no one in real life does this, where we're talking, we're like, no, but you didn't say that. It was just surreal. And I think when you come from a kind of school of acting, or whatever your imagination of acting is, mine, where you do nothing and you try and mimic real life, obviously that doesn't happen. So it felt like making these jumps that required a huge amount of trust in our director and our producers and your scene partner, Diego, in my case. And also trust that it's okay that it feels wrong and it feels weird, because it is a surreal universe, and you know, just hope for the best in an edit. But there were moments where we were like, you know, full actor psychosis. But all of the psychosis and all of the anxiety all contributed to it being, you know, what it was, which is a confused reality, warped reality. And then, yeah, our magic director fixed it all. I'm sure it was an effort.
There's something nice about living in that space of like a discovery, like a real discovery of doing something new and doing something that we were cracking every day. I mean, it was awful in real time, but in retrospect, it was really cool.
And I also love the idea of being able to sort of go back with a partner and analyze a relationship from its inception to its ending, collaborate on the U-turns that pivoted where you went wrong. You know, that concept existentially was what really drew me to the script, because I don't think I find anything more interesting than human connection and love and relationships. And, you know, it's sort of the most beautiful thing about being a human. So the idea, just in an abstract, of being able to do that with somebody was what drew me to it, and then what terrified me in the actual doing of it.
Because maybe the most sort of like overt example of this is there's a love scene in the film where Sienna, you're both performing the love scene and then also sort of, you know, commenting on it at the same time from what essentially is the future version of those characters. Did it feel like you were existing in like two emotional states at the same time, or almost playing two characters in one scene?
That's exactly what it felt like. It's exactly what it was. And it serves the story. It's technical. But yes, 1,000%. It was two people in one moment. Yeah. As in
Tara, that idea of having sort of like the past and the present, and even to some extent the future of the story taking place all at once. Did you ever sort of get lost in that? Like, was it difficult for you to sort of, whether in writing or also in shooting, to stay oriented as far as like where you were in the story, where the characters needed to be at a certain moment? Was that difficult to keep track of?
You know, we made a pretty big effort to check ourselves. Before we started shooting, I created like a proper timeline of how their entire relationship played out, like with dates, you know, or make believe dates, and just to make sure that everything actually happened in a way that made sense after I had written it all out of order, or like in an emotional timeline. But I think honestly, the harder thing was on this one, for some reason, it all made so much sense to me that there was so much that might not make sense to the producers or a key crew member or somebody else. It was always like, what piece of the madness might you not be getting right now that I have to like figure out? So it was just such I think a unique telling of a unique story in a unique way that there were a lot of time was spent sort of getting everybody into the like wander darkly state of mind, and how we were endeavoring to tell things. But and maybe the only time was, I remember at one point Diego said, so this line right here, is that in the past or is that in the present? And I was like, oh God, it's like sort of both. And poor Diego was like, oh, I don't know, okay. Like, but it really was, it was this sort of this duality, which I think honestly is, for me, very true. Even right now, right? Like I'm thinking about like something my kid said yesterday or something I have to do later tonight. Like unfortunately, I wish I was more focused in the present all the time, but my mind meanders and wanders. And I feel like that's not that unreal for people to be sort of reflecting and projecting and not in their moment.
And was there something that you found to be the biggest challenge as far as directing Sienna and Diego? Like, did you have sort of like a big fear or something you were concerned, like where it could maybe go a little off the rails?
Truthfully, just the fact that it was based on some level of my life felt very vulnerable. And there were times where if you're looking at a scene and a line doesn't work, or some of it doesn't work, it's not a big deal. But everything here felt like sort of hyper personal, and even though so much of it is fictionalized, but it definitely felt closer to me than anything I'd done previously. I've done a lot of gun for hire work. This is certainly my, like, what I would consider like my first film. And so just that pressure of feeling that it was so personal to me was different than what I'd done before.
And Sienna, what does that do for you to know that you're playing some version of this person that's standing right there? Like at some point, does it just sort of have to become fiction and become its own character and its own thing? Or are you still like checking in with Tara to be like, is this how it felt? Is that right?
I think initially I was sort of studying her a little bit just because it was a touchstone. It was like a place to go. It would have been too surreal for all of us if I'd held on to that. I think at a certain point it has to just take on its own form and be something unique. And Tara obviously encouraged us to do that. But I knew the resonance of how personal it was for her. I knew that this was basically her kind of beating heart on a page. And I think that responsibility is galvanizing and scary and beautiful. And, again, it's sort of what art should really be is that. But it became its own abstract thing once we were in the making of it.
Mm-hmm. Because I've heard you say elsewhere, Sienna, that the sort of the disorientation that you would sometimes feel, or the confusion you just might have in a scene, you just kind of had to learn to just use that and make that part of your performance. Like, how do you sort of come to that decision? Like the idea of like acknowledging your instinct would be to see that as like a weakness or a problem, and to sort of acknowledge that, like, no, like being confused or not sure of where I am is actually part of the performance. Like, how did you come to that realization?
A lot of it comes down to sort of trusting yourself as an artist, which is something I really wrestle with. I think part of the extreme confusion I felt while making this movie was because that's what the movie asked of me, but I don't give myself enough credit to say that that's actually what's happening. I can get in my head and overanalyze and be like, this isn't normal. And I feel so confused and, discombobulated. And I think about halfway through, I was like, of course, that's how I'm feeling. That's exactly what I'm supposed to feel. And a lot of acting for me is just about surrender and shutting off that critical voice, which is really loud often, and using what's available to you. It happens every time I work. I'm sort of become infected by whoever I'm playing, and then I'm like, what's happening? And then I have to remind myself, it's like, oh, that's because you're playing that person. And I think it's resistant of some form of method that takes over. I don't want to be like, I'm a method actor, and I try not to take it home. But the truth is, it just like, I'm too sensitive to not by osmosis absorb what's happening in my day to day. And that's what happened with this.
Tara, one of the things I find so fascinating in the movie is that the sort of the perspective very much is, and the sort of like the emotional reality of the movie is very much Sienna's character, but you still make a lot of room for Diego's character and to have sort of like his point of view on things. And that's, so a lot of times, I don't know how to put it, it almost became like a version of the movie Marriage Story, as far as like you're seeing it from his point of view, you're seeing it from her point of view. Was it important to you that those sort of like shifting perspectives be a part of it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think having been with my husband for 20 years, it certainly is clear to me that we have two very different points of view on almost everything that's ever happened. you know, and I think it's really important to understand the other side of a story and the other side of somebody else's experience in a relationship. And I think in this case, in particular, I love how Mateo sort of looked at things with these rose-colored glasses, and Adrian is sort of constantly pushing for the truth, as if the truth is this dark and heavy, and like we got to get down to the grime of it. And it was not great. It was not great, and it's actually like it's both, and she really can't sort of heal and move on until she has like his version of it with her. And I think there is this sense of like that the power of story and the power of story that we tell ourselves about our relationships, and the way that we craft our past and look at our past is really how we're going to play out our future. So yeah, I thought it was really important to let him have a voice in this. And on set, there was quite a bit of negotiation about, is it her version of his voice or is it really his voice? But I'll leave that up to audiences to decide how they feel about it.
Because I always found that just fascinating, like how often I found myself wondering, like, are they being good partners to each other? Is this like even a good relationship in the first place? Like just that aspect of the story, I found really compelling as it was playing out. And Sienna, what was it like for you as far as to know that some of those scenes were going to be a little open-ended as far as which perspective it was going to be, or the extent to which, I don't know if there are any scenes where you think maybe Diego's character is right, or is your character maybe isn't behaving as well in certain scenes. Like, how did you sort of deal with that aspect of the relationship?
Yeah, I never think about an edit. I have made films that I've never seen. I don't spend any time wondering like what the justice is or how I'm going to be portrayed. Like I will show up and do my part, tell the story, love the woman, let it go. Like that's fundamentally my process. There are moments where I guess in the aftermath I could be judgmental. I have to love who I'm playing. I have to be on their side. But at the same time, the script was so compassionate. I kind of got it all. And that's what made it land, I suppose, and made it real to me when I read it, was that life is really messy and everybody has a different perspective and everybody's memory is clouded by their own day or life or childhood or whatever it may be. And it's an interesting thing to look at how people see the world differently and to spend time in that space. But in terms of how it ends up, like that's not my part of the job. Maybe if I direct a movie one day, I'll start getting into that. But right now, no.
And now, Tara, we are here for the Los Angeles Times, and so I want to be sure that I'm asking you a little bit about the film is set in Los Angeles. It's shot in Los Angeles, and it features this really quite evocative line of spending eternity on the 10 freeway. What did we do to deserve this? How much of like the movie, like what was it that made you want to set the movie in Los Angeles, and how much did the sort of the Los Angeles-ness of it, the locations you chose, how much did that impact the movie for you?
So much, really, truly. I live on the east side of LA. We shot in my house. You can see Sienna was holding the baby in the house back here at some point. I really love the culture of Los Angeles. I wanted to do something with an interethnic relationship. The script was already sort of evolving that way with Day of the Dead and the travel to Mexico and the dolphins and everything, and it all sort of grew organically in that direction. I just don't see Los Angeles, the LA that I live in West Adams, depicted in media, films, television enough. So I find it a really beautiful and layered and rich landscape to play in. And it was really important to us in the development process, like Los Angeles as a character, how, it was like sort of like the idea of the grids of the city is where we start, and this character who's really trying to get things under control and keep things sort of in a box, and the characters are very boxed in the beginning of the movie, And then this accident sort of unhinges her. And at the end of the movie, it's like a wide open vista, which is all very much in this part of the world that you don't get everywhere. And we had opportunities to shoot this in other states, tax rebates and all that. And it's a real testament to the producers that they fought for us to stay in LA and that we were standing on the 10 freeway and, we were all over the place. So, and, there's just something magical about the city that I think needed to be a part of this romance. Yeah.
And now the movie premiered earlier this year at the Sundance Film Festival, way back in the before times. And I'm wondering for both of you, does the movie play differently at all now with everything that's happened over the past year than it did in January? I know for myself watching the movie, that feeling of like, am I crazy? Am I losing my mind? Like, I'm much more familiar with that feeling than I was like in January. And so, Tara, do you feel like there's something about the movie that plays differently now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a really wonderful premiere at Sundance, and strangers were like holding each other and sharing tissues, and there was something really communal that happened in our premiere at Sundance that was beautiful. But I have to say, since COVID, and we're all in these sort of isolated spaces with our families, this disoriented state where you're sort of forced to maybe reassess and revisit the value of the nuclear family. I think certainly Wander Darkly sort of is swimming right up that lane. So people have responded in a very personal and beautiful way in both arenas. But I think maybe people need it a little bit more now. And look, if people aren't lucky enough to be able to go and see it in the theater, I think it's quite a lovely thing to watch this at home with someone you love. And hopefully it gives people a little bit of heart and a little bit of a sense of what we're all capable of surviving,
Sienna, have your feelings about the movie changed at all over the past few months?
I think everyone can relate to Adrian's state of mind. Like, what is happening? Am I alive? Yeah, I mean, whatever collective, like absolute abstract confusion that we're all feeling is manifest in that character. So I think it could not be more perfect, quite frankly.
I know, Sienna, you also were recently in the film American Woman, and along with that, and Wander Darkly, your performances over the past few years, there's just been something really ferocious and exciting about them, even some of the supporting roles that you've done. Has something changed for you over the past few years? Like whether it's what you're looking for from performances, what you think you're bringing to your performances, do you feel like something's changed for you over the past few years?
I think there was a really strong narrative that I was associated with, which just distracted everything else. If I look back on, I did this movie Factory Girl when I was 23. I'm still really proud of that performance. But the narrative that went alongside what I was doing creatively was so loud that it kind of eclipsed the work. I think I had a child and people were like, oh, she's actually a woman and, a serious person perhaps. And it's funny, I do, yeah, I think I don't know. I think the roles for women are better. I think the conversation about roles for women has improved. I feel more confident in my capabilities. I feel more able to define myself as an artist and not as a media perception or creation. And yeah, but it's funny, people sort of feel like that this happened at a kind of late stage, and then I look back on some of the work I was doing, and I also see strength in that too, and weaknesses, of course. I don't know. Hard to analyze. I use these interviews as like a sort of therapy session because you get in these deep chats. I'm like, wow, but yeah, it's like late in London.
And Tara, just the last thing that I want to ask you is simply in your director's statement for the film, you say that I want people to walk out of the film and go home and have sex or hug their children or call their parents.
Yes.
Those are three very different things.
Yeah, you get to pick one of those. You have to do one.
Well, can you explain a bit like what you do want people to take away from the film, considering the fact that it is so complicated and it kind of does bring up so many sort of like disparate feelings for people? For you, what are people sort of left with at the end of the movie?
I'm really hoping that people feel incredibly lucky for the love that they have in their lives, the connection that they have in their lives, and that you don't wait to say that you say it while you have that moment. Yeah, that you feel more connected to other people at the end of it. I really do think that we connect much more in our grief than we do in our happiness. It's incredibly human to it's inevitable, right? We all lose people, we all grieve, and understanding that, maybe you feel a little bit less outside the world than you did a minute ago.
And Sienna, how would you feel about what you'd want sort of people taking away from the movie?
I find it really life affirming. I think I agree with Tara that it sort of celebrates the connection between people, and to be grateful for what you have, to appreciate the moments, whether they're messy or complicated, or but to really embrace humanity and the human experience in all of its messy, beautiful ways. And I think this movie really does that. It's hard life, and it's beautiful.
And that seems like a wonderful place for us to wrap this up. I thank the both of you for joining us today. And for information on other events from the Los Angeles Times, be sure to go to latimes.com/subscribe. Sienna Miller, Tara Miele, thanks so much for joining us. For the LA Times, I'm Mark Olsen.